Welcome to MIT Supply Chain Frontiers from the MIT Center for Transportation and Logistics. Each episode features center researchers and staff who welcome experts from the field for in-depth conversations about business, education, and beyond. On today's episode, research scientists Alexis, Bateman, and Inma Borrella speak with Mark Bakker, Senior Vice President and General Manager of Global Operations at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, about the skills and tools needed for sustained global supply chain management when facing disruptions. Take it away, Inma and Alexis.
Today, we're really fortunate to have Mr. Mark Bakker, Senior Vice President and General Manager of Global Operations for Hewlett Packard Enterprises. Thank you so much for joining us today and welcome.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, maybe in some cases to everybody. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so Mark, would you like to kick it off and introduce yourself and give a brief overview of HP?
I lead global operations for Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Hewlett Packard Enterprise is a spin-off of the original Hewlett Packard company, founded in 1939 by Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard, considered as the founding fathers of Silicon Valley. About 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago, the company went through a significant restructuring and separated itself in two pieces. One piece is HP, still considered HP, which takes care of print and personal systems. And the other part, Hewlett Packard Enterprise, which is focused on the enterprise side of products, server business, storage, data management, networking equipment, and its associated services. That's the area where I work and lead the Global Operations organization. Global Operations is a combination of what is considered customer operations, everything front end, taking care of order management activities, quoting, pricing, and so on. And then there is what you could call classic supply chain activities, a part of Global Operations. And classic supply chain activities include planning, everything around planning. Planning is everything. We can talk more about that as we continue the dialogue, but fulfilling the product, logistics, engineering is included in that, sourcing. So true end-to-end supply chain activities fall under my responsibility. We are here to support the business. We're here to support customers. On the front end, the customer operations piece, we are here to support the business to be successful. When they sell product, we want to make sure that customers get their products, delivered. Because the reality is, if you sell but you do not deliver, the company doesn't make any revenue or doesn't make any profit off of it, because a customer doesn't pay for something he doesn't receive. It's the most exciting part of the business because you are in the middle of everything and touching every part of a company. From a front end, engaging with customers, to being involved in manufacturing and sourcing, supporting the P&L performance of a business, and so on. So,
thank you, Mark. Thank you for the great introduction to HP and also for the passionate defense of the supply chain management space, which I could not agree more that supply chain is so relevant for the business and how it connects everything and how it's so interesting to work in that space. So now let's dive into some questions. So can you talk a little bit more about some of those applications, forecasting, inventory management, transportation management, and how they impact the top and bottom line of your business?
I said planning is everything, and that truly is the case. Not to minimize, marginalize, the importance of other domains or functional areas in a supply chain environment. But it starts with a plan, and it's fairly simple. Demand, enterprise environment, customers are thinking about what they're going to spend their money on, or what investments are they going to make in the next year. What is very challenging in a supply chain environment is to know early enough what the demand is going to look like. What are customers going to order from us? And when you think about a tech product, whether it is a PC or a printer or, in our case, a server, there is a lot of components that go in there. There is memory chips, there is processors, there's motherboards, there is storage device, hard disk drive or solid state drives, network cards, all those things, make up a product, and you need to know how many of those parts you need where in your supply chain, in your manufacturing network. If you are wrong, if you plan it wrongly, so you do not have enough parts, you get customer orders, that you cannot fulfill within a certain period of time. If you have too many parts, at the end of a period, you sit on inventory, which has a value, and that value sits on your balance sheet, is a drag on your cash conversion cycle, on your cash performance, cash flow performance for the company, which if you are a private company, you may be able to handle it depending on your financial statements and how much cash you actually have available. But if you're a publicly traded company, that can be an influencer in the performance of your stock on the stock exchange. So two things. One is, if you don't plan right, you have two evils, which is, one is, your customers will not be happy with you because they place an order and you tell them, well, I can only service you 5 months from now. The other way around is, I have too much stuff, your financial performance, takes a hit. So planning, super important, and it goes into a lot of detail. So data science, data management, analytics, etc., comes together with managing, the physical world of parts and components, in an environment. So planning, forecasting, hugely important in the value chain, as such.
This is great, and actually you highlighted one point that we repeat over and over and over during our courses, that in supply chains you always have to make these decisions that are trade-offs,
right,
between having too much and having too little, and just finding the right balance is very challenging, but it's also like the way to go. So thanks so much, Mark. I think that you responded.
And I think one important aspect of that as well is, depending on the company, the product, there's sometimes this aspect of perishable. Perishable, is a term, which goes both ways. One is, from a customer demand point of view, customer demand can be perishable. Think about government spend. Government spend has a budget for the year. And typically they have to spend it before a certain date. And if they don't, that budget is gone because we've moved into the next year. That's how, that demand might be perishable. So if you do not take the order, fulfill the order, it's gone. It will not come back. The flip side is, from a material point of view or inventory point of view, some products, or some parts, they can perish as well. Depending on what the product set is and so on, those are things that become even more important.
Definitely. Thank you, Mark.
Given that you are running global supply chains and global operations, how have you seen COVID-19 and the disruptions challenge and complicate global supply chain management, and perhaps also how you've seen it drive innovation? Yeah,
in recent years, in particular, supply chain disruptions, have become more common. Even nowadays, the White House in the United States, right, starts to talk about it. But supply chain disruptions, they're significant, and I keep telling everybody they're becoming more frequently, and they're becoming bigger. I've been doing this for close to 20 years in the meantime, and over those years I've seen various forms of disruptions, with significant floods in Thailand, that disrupted the hard disk drive manufacturing, earthquakes resulting in tsunamis in Japan. I've seen volcano eruptions in Iceland that, created an ash cloud over, Western Europe, which disrupted, air freight. And air freight is hugely important when you talk about logistics and transportation, right? I've seen many over the years, but most of the time, those are isolated in one particular area. I mean, there's other examples of a factory catching fire, which reduces a significant amount of capacity globally, but it's contained in one area. The difference with last year is that the pandemic, affected everything and everybody almost at the same time. Nobody spared, and impacted from finished goods manufacturing facilities to component manufacturing facilities to logistics networks because of local authority restrictions on moving of people and goods, even to the point of if we would be able to find parts, build them, and ship them, customers being closed because they shut down their offices, and there's nobody to receive, anything. So a good supply chain organization has a focus on business continuity planning and how do you react to disruptions and so on. But typically it's a reactive activity. You always review the latest event that happened and you adjust your plan accordingly and say, what did we learn from this event and what do we need to adjust in our continuity planning? That's great, but you never plan for the eventuality of the next, and we don't know what the next one is. We know something's coming. After the pandemic, there is a new disruption coming. Actually, the latest and the greatest already happened, which was the vessel that got stuck in the Suez Canal, which disrupted, about 10%, 15% of global trade. We were also focused on pandemic related stuff. Did anybody think about, what are we going to do if a vessel gets stuck in the Suez Canal? I think it opened our eyes to even more global disruption happening at the same time. Even CEOs and boards now think about supply chain disruptions and they talk about resiliency and agility. Are we resilient? I think many of us will say, yeah, we were resilient because if you think of it, it took the world maybe one quarter. And after that, we restarted global supply chains fairly quickly. So we have a certain level of resiliency, built in. And I think considering the magnitude of the pandemic, we've proven that we are resilient, but are we resilient enough? Probably not, because we want to be even faster. We don't want 3 months, 4 months, before we feel that we have enough toilet paper, on the shelves again, right? We want it to be a week, 2 weeks, or board members or CEOs want it to not happen at all. Now, that is more difficult. Resiliency, agility in the supply chain environment comes with a cost. You can duplicate your entire infrastructure, say, but then you have a lot of idle capacity, which has a lot of cost. You have a lot of inventory sitting in both places, which is very expensive. So there is this right balance to find, in terms of I want to be resilient and agile. And agility is probably the more important aspect of this whole resiliency and disruption conversation, which means, how fast can you switch? How fast can you react and resolve the problem? I think that's where we're learning a lot, about the importance of data, the importance of systems, the importance of visibility in your entire supply chain. What is happening where are your capacity constraints, your overcapacity, where are your parts, your components. I think this is where, again, supply chain becomes a fascinating space to work in. The importance of IT solutions, applications, etc., and the connection. Supply chain cannot function well without a proper architecture and a proper infrastructure of tools and systems and processes that provide the right level of visibility, which you then can use for multiple reasons: to react to the agility piece, but also to be better in terms of the way you serve customers and so on. So I think we knew that already, but the whole pandemic situation only amplified, the importance of that.
Yeah. One dimension that you mentioned was now that the supply chain has, the clearing of shelves and those physical manifestations of that disruption, it's escalated it to conversations that may not have existed before, such as at the C-suite level or, in the White House. And of course, my dad finally knows what a supply chain is. So do you see that recognition of the criticality of supply chains changing the dynamic of the investment of resources to plan?
Absolutely. I think, the importance of supply chain, or recognition for supply chain as a critical business process, if you want, increased substantially, during pandemic, but actually it started already before. There's, several events that triggered, reactions from, CEOs and boards of companies, etc., which was more not so much pandemic related, but global trade and trade tension related. the introduction of import duties or tariffs on products manufactured in China created a significant wave of reactions, in particularly in the United States, companies, headquartered in the United States, U.S. companies, they have a significant portion of their business depending on the revenue they make in the United States. For many years enjoyed zero import duty, zero tariffs, on their products. All of a sudden, it became 15%, 25%. And that's a huge impact, right? If you think of it, all of a sudden you have 25% more cost. And if you don't plan for it, and consumers that buy those products not necessarily want to see prices go up by 25%, because of it. So that created, already a lot more interest, in the whole concept of supply chain and other dimensions as well. But pandemic, again, amplified some of that. As the global operations lead, I report to the CEO. I'm a member of the executive leadership team of the company. Take it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the supply chain leader would probably be sitting in a level 2, level 3 part of the organization, doing more or less the same thing. But the impact in multiple areas has triggered the attention of leadership teams and boards and so on. And like you said, including politics. And it's about, the impact on the financials of a company, but also other things have become more and more relevant. Social, environmental, corporate responsibility aspects, become more and more important. We are seeing, as one of those things is that corporate enterprise and even more so public sector, so government agencies are making some of those aspects part of their RFQ. So when they tender, their business saying, I'm interested in buying a ton of equipment from, somebody, but I want to know, is the product you're selling to me, is there anything around conflict minerals or labor issues, or what's your impact on the environment, the way you manufacture stuff or the way you transport stuff. I want to understand, and it becomes a criteria for decision making more and more. And because of that, all of a sudden more people start paying attention to those things, right? So definitely seen that happen over the years I've been involved in this, that it becomes more of a conversation in the boardroom.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like I said, the most recent, example of that is in the tech industry. There is another issue happening right now, which is the semiconductor shortage, right? Or the chip shortage you read about in the news, due to significantly more demand or recovery after pandemic happening faster than anybody anticipated, but also more sectors, needing those chips. Automotive, cars nowadays, have a lot more technology in them than they used to maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. Smartphones, keep growing. People working from home, studying from home, all need laptops, and more so than ever before. We have the switch from 4G to 5G on smartphone, on telecom, which comes with IoT, right? Internet of Things. There's more devices that can connect and they can talk through mobile networks. So more and more of those chips required. Now there is a shortage. Everybody is, concerned about it. Automotive plants, are down. They're not producing as many cars as they can. They have millions of backlog because they're missing a 25-cent part. That's it, right? A whole car cannot be finished because they're missing one 25-cent part. And so that has led to President Biden, doing a workshop with leaders from the tech industry to talk about how can we fix this problem. We need to invest in the United States because we need to reduce that dependency. So you see how, supply chain as a concept, as a practice becomes more and more relevant, more important, and enters, a whole range of new discussions. It's exciting. Living that shortage, is not so exciting, but like I said, if it's not this one, it will be something else, in the years to come. So.
Great. So let's continue with another question. And I think this one connects very well with something you mentioned earlier, Mark. all these disruptions we've seen in the past year and the other ones you mentioned, right? We've seen that has driven innovation and also digital transformation in many companies. So could you share a little bit how has HP innovated and built more resilience just through implementing more digital technologies?
Yeah, super trendy supply chain disruptions, resilience, agility, super trendy words, right? Digital transformation, also very trendy, but very important. Actually, from the company perspective, Hewlett Packard Enterprise, there is the two parts, right? The job I have, that requires, digital transformation and a solid architecture and infrastructure to support that. But the company sells, solutions, that help do digital transformation for companies, right? So it's top of mind, for me from multiple aspects. What have we done? There's a lot of development in new systems and capabilities. The backbone of any supply chain and operational environment is the ERP system, enterprise resource planning. What you see typically is companies over the years, big companies, large enterprise companies, they go through growth, they acquire other companies, they started off being, a decentralized company, and then they started centralizing and globalizing more, resulting in, having 10, 15, 20 different versions of ERP, which, if you're the supply chain guy, is a nightmare, because that means, you have 20 different versions, of data to look at. So what you want to do is try to get to one single instance of an ERP. But one single instance of an ERP in a global company that runs billions and billions of dollars in transactions through it is also a challenge, because then you get into performance issues and, and so on, right? So, but a lot has happened over the years with large companies like SAP and Oracle, developing new state of the art 2021, 2022 style solutions there. So what we've done, as have others, migrated our ERP system to the latest version. That's tricky because, as I said, it's the backbone of the company. And so, it's like open heart surgery, what you do, because you're running your shop and you're trying to put something new in place. You still have lots of customers that place orders that need to be fulfilled and so on, right? So those are exciting things. So that's one. The other one is investments in the planning solutions, demand planning, forecasting, and so on, investments there. But I think the most impactful and where there's a lot of development from a digital transformation and investments in IT infrastructure architecture is the capturing of data. The biggest challenge, in a supply chain environment is that it's end to end, right? You go from customer demand, which talks about a unit. A sales guy wants to talk dollars. The manufacturing guy wants to talk units. The sourcing guy wants to talk parts. I don't care about how many finished goods, you're talking. I need to know how many hard drives, how many processors, how many network cards I need to go buy and which ones. The logistics guy doesn't care about that. He cares about kilos. He cares about pallets. He cares about containers, ocean vessels, airplane ULDs, and cost per kilogram, on uplifting that stuff, right? So each of them have their own version unit of measure, and each of them will generate tons of data. And if you then have, my logistics data in one database with those units of measures, and I have my planning database and I have my manufacturing database, how do I take all that stuff and aggregate it and make some sense out of it from an end-to-end, left to right perspective, right? That's where there's a lot of opportunity, a lot of investment as well. Visibility is hugely important, and huge investments, creating networks whereby you hook up suppliers and logistics providers and manufacturing partners, etc. You hook them up into a network where all that data comes together, and then you put this layer of data analytics, data science, and now we go into the artificial intelligence, machine learning, that can help a ton. That's the next evolution if you think about digital transformation. We're investing in from a demand planning forecasting point of view is that, we have a lot of historical data. What algorithms can we develop that will help us to be more accurate in our forecasting?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think like digital transformation is a huge challenge, and anyone that is like trying to make it happen in their company know that it is.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, I thought that was really fascinating, just kind of putting in sort of those, sort of that singular objective of each of those roles, right? That they need to get their job done, but really to make supply chain effective, you have to look across all those functions and put them together. So you touched on it a little bit earlier, but something near and dear to my heart and many is the shift to sustainability and supply chain. We've seen clearly there's a push for sustainability, broadly in business, but the centralization and strategicness of supply chain, owning sustainability, driving it across the value chain. Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen that and what do you think it means for some of the professionals we have on the line?
Sustainability again has different aspects. There's a social aspect to it. There's an environmental aspect to it. I engage with a fair amount of peers of mine, practitioners in different companies, even different industries. And everybody, it's just simply, everybody realizes, like us in our daily lives, we've become a lot more conscious about, the impact we all have on planet and the role we can and need to play. And there is, one big truth, which is in the supply chain environment, supply chain has a huge impact. Logistics, manufacturing, right? Depending on what you manufacture, how you manufacture, and any kind of emissions, that are there, have an impact. Logistics, CO2 emissions, it's simply, no denying that doing those things, has CO2 emissions are there, which is bad for, the environment, and we need to be conscious about it. So it's just simply the right thing to do to focus on it. Secondly, as we all, as consumers, as human beings, become more sensitive to this, we are also human beings that have a professional life. We work in companies. We are people that become decision makers in these companies. And as we become more sensitized and conscious about, the impact, we build that into the decision making process of what we buy. That finds itself into procurement departments in companies. And when you then run a business, there's the two aspects. You want to do what's right. And secondly, your customers are asking for it. So it becomes an imperative by design to focus on and to do the right thing. That's mostly, the most sensitivity is around the environmental stuff. But for us, in the larger HP company and Hewlett Packard Enterprise now, for many years, we've also been very concerned about labor conditions. We set up together with our tech partners, in the industry, think about Apple and so on, set up huge factories in China where all these products are being manufactured. Millions of people working there. The conditions in some of these are manufacturing places that have 250, 500,000 people that live in the factory dorm. And so those conditions, have been a focus for us in the tech industry for sure, because it's just the right thing to do. Similar, when you go into tech, some of the components or raw material required to build components, where they come from, it's mining. And so what are the conditions, in mining? Are we sending little kids into mines? The conflict mineral story in Africa, those are things that are hugely important, and it's hard because it goes deep into upstream into your supply chain, right? It goes from raw material, building this stuff, and how do you control all those things? And again, it's just the right thing to do. We need to keep working it. Is it perfect? I don't think it's perfect, right? I mean, there's stuff happening every day, all day in certain places from a people impact perspective in communities around the world. From an environmental perspective, it's a challenge, right? Because we all want stuff to be built, and we want it cheap and we want it fast, and then it's easy to cut corners, but it has an impact, and we need to be conscious about it, and we need to find ways, all of us together, on how we solve that problem.
Yeah, that was really well said, really interesting. I think the social side is critical to our supply chains, and is sort of a hidden issue that people really don't understand about some of the conditions that are deep in supply chains that are at the raw material phase of mining and production. And I think it was just really great to kind of look at the big
And there's
picture of sustainability, that it's all encompassing.
and
Yeah.
and there is this aspect of cost that comes into play. One big problem where probably many of us are aware of is the amount of plastic in ocean, right? Huge opportunity that provides a huge source of material to collect it, right? To melt it and to reuse it as resin, becoming plastics, for products and so on. But it's cheaper, to pump oil out of the ground, make resin, virgin resin as they call it, and use that. It's cheaper than to go out into the ocean, collect all this stuff. Then you need to melt it, you need to clean it because it's not, virgin. So colors, things like that. We've had this big debate in the company, in our printing division about, building white printers. And, you take virgin plastic, you can make it as white can be. You use recycled plastic, getting it white as white can be is practically impossible because there's contamination in it, one way or another. And the amount of time you would have to clean it and filter it and so on is just not practical, not possible even. But then the question becomes, as consumers, right? How important is it that that printer is white as white can be, or is it okay if it's a little bit less white? Or is it okay, to pay $5 more so that we can collectively, go out, collect all these bottles, plastic, from the ocean, etc., recycle it, and so on. And those are, the really fundamental societal questions, that we struggle with, because many of us as consumers, if you're not involved in it, you just don't know, some of these practicalities of it or the differences, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A great way to frame it. Inma, do you want to grab some questions to start with so we can get a few
Yes.
questions before we end?
So let's start with this one. So what is one of the skills you consider most valuable for someone working in the supply chain?
I think there's multiple skills that I think are important. Nowadays, no matter what domain, whether it is planning or transportation or logistics or manufacturing, engineering, etc., I think the most important skill is almost like curiosity, focus on innovation. There's innovation possible in each and every one of these areas. Innovation with a customer mindset, right? Focused on what will help our customers be more successful. Innovation in process improvement, analytics. We talked about data, the abundance of available data, and using that data to your advantage. Technical stuff, like I said, even if you're an engineer working in a supply chain environment, engineering products, need to be introduced into a manufacturing environment. Yeah, depending on which domain, there's plenty of interesting skills required and apply.
Okay, so data literacy and like skills, innovation, and customer centric would be like three of the pillars. And then, of course, beyond that, like many other skills. Thanks, Mark. Alexis, would you like to pick another one?
Yeah, absolutely. So Darjat asks how resiliency was implemented in your supply chain during the pandemic and now into the new normal.
So we did another round of working with our manufacturing facilities and partners and suppliers on, taking a look at their business continuity plans. We revisited areas where we felt, we might be single sourced. We looked at, our system capabilities to transfer quickly from one location to another. Because sometimes, people think that it's easy, or just move manufacturing of product A to another location. But if you don't have your system set up, don't have your products set up in the system on what the bill of material is to go build, that product, you can move the material, but the line worker doesn't know what to do with that order because he doesn't see it in his system, right? So we looked at things like that. relooked obviously again at all the locations around the world where they are, and are they more susceptible to disruptions than other places. There's more, because as I said, this has opened our eyes to a whole new concept of disruptions when it happens everywhere at the same time, as opposed to one single area, that is affected. So more that can and needs to be done.
So going back to the digital transformation discussion that we started earlier, what is the approach, or your approach, to increase adherence to the new tools and processes that you're implementing? You talk about the challenge of bringing everyone together in the new ERP system. So how are you actually incentivizing people to make this move?
So there's two parts to it. One is, when you go through those mega transformation activities and you implement new systems, one of the important aspects of the process or the project itself is to switch off the old one. So, you transition and you migrate over to the new one. And once you're done and everybody's on the new one, you switch off the other one so that nobody can go back, because that would be a disaster. And the second one is the new systems, new ERPs, they're designed and developed in a way most of the time that they guide the process, right? So it's built on a business process, or a business process is built on the systemic capabilities. In some cases, these things become a lot more rigorous. So depending on what you do in the process, you sometimes don't even have a choice. And then it's change management. With these big transformations, management of change, and helping people to migrate over. Change is hard. We can talk for another hour about change management of change. How do you do these big projects, right? And how do you get people to adopt and adapt to change? It's hard. It's really hard, because people are used to something, and you give them something new or something different, and to migrate over is always a challenge. Some people are more eager to do that kind of stuff. Some people are more conservative and say, I just like the way things are today. And you need to manage that very carefully.
Absolutely. That's really helpful. So supply chains need to be agile, and people as well. And so
That's
learning
right.
and upgrading all the time. Any final words for our professionals, Mark, and as we sign off?
No, it was my pleasure to be here and cover some of these fascinating and interesting topics. I enjoy talking about these things. I enjoy being a practitioner, and I hope it was helpful.
We so appreciate your time, and yes, super fascinating for us and all those that were on the line. So really, really thankful for your time, and everyone have a great day.
Have a great day, and thanks for sharing your passion, Mark.
Thank you.
It really came through.
All right, everyone. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this edition of MIT Supply Chain Frontiers. My name is Arthur Grau, Communications Officer for the Center. I invite you to visit us anytime at ctl.mit.edu or search for MIT Supply Chain Frontiers on your favorite listening platform. Until next time.